Hello and welcome to Nightmare Lullabies. As you settle in for the night, prepare to be immersed in a world of eerie whispers and unsettling tales, designed to both chill and soothe. Now, close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness carry you away. And if these nightly tales captivate you, feel free to join our community for more whispered secrets. The city of Paderborn, Germany, was quiet on the evening of June 20th, 2006. The summer air was warm, and the streets were calm as most people had already settled into their nightly routines. For 21-year-old Frauke Liebs, it was a typical Tuesday night, until it wasn't. Frauke was a nursing student with a bright future ahead of her. She was well-liked, known for her friendly and compassionate nature. That evening, she had been watching a World Cup football match with friends at a local pub, cheering as England faced off against Sweden. The atmosphere was lively, filled with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and excited commentary from football fans. As the game ended, Frauke, feeling exhausted after a long day, said her goodbyes and left around 11 p.m. She planned to return to her shared apartment, where her roommate, Natasha, was expecting her back soon. Her walk home should have been uneventful. Paderborn was a relatively safe city, and the distance to her apartment was only a short journey away. But that night, something went horribly wrong. By midnight, Frauke had not arrived home. Natasha wasn't immediately concerned. Perhaps Frauke had run into someone she knew, or had decided to stay out a bit longer. But then, at 12:49 a.m., a message arrived on Natasha's phone. "Coming home later. Love you. Frauke." It was short, simple, and seemingly reassuring. But there was something odd about it. Frauke's phrasing was unusual, almost too formal. She typically didn't sign off messages with her name when texting close friends. Still, Natasha brushed it off, assuming Frauke was simply being playful or had enjoyed another round of drinks with friends. Morning came, and there was still no sign of Frauke. Natasha called her multiple times, but the phone rang without an answer. It wasn't until later that afternoon that another message came through. "Don't worry, I'll be home later." By now, Natasha felt something was wrong. The wording of the text felt unnatural again, and Frauke's phone had been off between messages, which wasn't like her at all. If she had stayed out somewhere, why hadn't she called? And why was her phone only turning on briefly to send cryptic messages before going silent again? Concerned, Natasha contacted Frauke's family. Her brother, Frauke Liebs, shared the growing sense of unease. Frauke was responsible, and had never gone completely off the radar like this before. That evening, the family decided to go to the police and report her missing. The police took their statement, but weren't immediately alarmed. Frauke was an adult, and it wasn't uncommon for young people to stay out late without informing everyone of their whereabouts. But Natasha and Frank knew better. Something wasn't right. Then another message came. "I will be home soon." It was brief, vague, and did nothing to ease anyone's concerns. The hours dragged on with no further communication. When night fell again, the family sat anxiously, hoping the next morning would bring clarity. But the next morning came, and Frauke was still missing. As the sun rose over Paderborn on the morning of June 21st, the absence of Frauke Liebs had already settled into an ominous weight on the shoulders of those who knew her best. The city's normal routine continued as though nothing had changed, but for Frauke's family and friends, the world had tilted into an unsettling uncertainty. Something was deeply wrong, even if the police had yet to recognize the urgency of the situation. Frauke's mother, Liebs, had barely slept. The cryptic text messages sent to Natasha throughout the night lingered in her mind. They didn't feel right. The words were oddly formal, detached in a way that wasn't like her daughter at all. Frauke never signed her texts with her full name, nor did she send vague reassurances instead of explanations. By the afternoon, another message arrived. "I will be home soon. Don't worry." The words did little to ease the growing anxiety. Frauke was still out there somewhere, but where? And why wasn't she answering calls? The police, for now, remained unconvinced that anything criminal had occurred. Frauke was an adult, and they had seen similar cases before. Young people going off the grid for a few days, only to return unharmed. But Frauke's family and friends knew better. Something wasn't adding up. When Natasha attempted to call back after receiving the latest message, the phone rang a few times before cutting off. Then, as before, it was switched off again. That evening, Frauke's brother, Frauke Liebs, took matters into his own hands. He began retracing Frauke's last known movements, visiting the pub where she had last been seen. The bartender remembered her, smiling, laughing, leaving around 11 p.m. There had been no signs of distress, no indication that she had been in trouble. Frank also spoke with several of Frauke's friends who had been at the pub that night. One of them mentioned something curious. Frauke's phone battery had been running low earlier in the evening, yet she had continued to send messages in the days following her disappearance. How was that possible? Had she borrowed a charger from someone? Had someone else been keeping her phone charged? The mystery deepened the following day. On June 22nd, another text message arrived, just as vague as the others. "I will be home soon. I promise." This time, something felt even more off. The text had been sent from a cell tower not in Paderborn, but several miles outside the city, in a rural area. Someone had Frauke's phone, and they were moving it. The implications were chilling. Had Frauke gone willingly, or was someone holding her against her will? That evening, the phone rang for the first time. It was Frauke's number. Natasha's heart nearly stopped as she answered, her voice shaking. "Frauke!" There was a pause. Then finally a voice. "Natasha." It was Frauke. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The worry, the fear, the endless unanswered questions. Relief flooded through Natasha. "Frauke, where are you? What's going on?" "I can't stay long," Frauke said, her voice strangely slow, as though she were exhausted or drugged. "I just wanted to say I'm okay." Tears welled in Natasha's eyes. "Frauke, please, tell me where you are. We'll come get you." "I can't," Frauke murmured. "I'll be home soon." The line went dead. Natasha stared at the phone in stunned silence. The relief she had felt a moment ago was gone, replaced with a deeper fear. That hadn't sounded like the Frauke she knew. Something was very, very wrong. The family immediately took this information to the police. This was no longer just a case of a young woman staying out too late. Frauke had spoken, but her words had been devoid of emotion, empty in a way that sent shivers down the spines of those who loved her. Still, the authorities hesitated. Without concrete evidence of a crime, their hands were tied. They could investigate, but without proof of foul play, Frauke was still just a missing person. It wasn't a crime to disappear voluntarily. The next day, another message arrived. "I can't stay out much longer." The words sent a chill through the room. It was the first indication that Frauke might be in distress. Her family pleaded with her via text to call again, to tell them where she was. Hours passed with no response. Then, late in the evening, the phone rang again. This time, Frauke's mother answered. "Frauke," Ingrid whispered, "please tell us where you are." "I can't," Frauke said again, her voice still unnaturally calm. "But I love you all." Tears rolled down Ingrid's cheeks. "Frauke, are you in danger? Is someone with you?" A pause. Then, "I have to go." Click. The silence that followed was suffocating. This wasn't normal. This wasn't voluntary. Frauke was in trouble. By now, the police were starting to see the gravity of the situation. They worked with cell tower records to determine where the phone calls had been coming from. What they found only deepened the mystery. Each call, each text, had been sent from a different location, all in rural areas outside Paderborn. Whoever had Frauke's phone, and possibly Frauke herself, was moving constantly, never staying in one place for too long. Another night passed. No new messages. No more calls. And Frauke was still missing. The days following Frauke's last phone call stretched into a painful, unbearable silence. Her family, her friends, and the police were left waiting for the next message, the next call, anything that might provide a clue to where she was. But nothing came. Frauke Liebs, Frauke's older brother, couldn't shake the sense of dread tightening around him like a vice. He had spent every waking moment scouring the areas where her phone had last been traced. The realization that whoever had her, or her phone, was deliberately moving around made his stomach churn. If this was some kind of game, it was a cruel one. On the morning of June 25th, for days after Frauke's disappearance, the silence was finally broken. Frauke's phone rang again. This time, it was her father who answered. "Frauke!" A brief pause. Then the familiar voice. "Papa!" His heart leaped, but something felt off. Her voice lacked warmth, emotion. It was almost robotic. "Frauke, my love, where are you?" "I can't say," she responded, her tone distant. "But I'm okay. Please, Frauke, come home. If someone is with you, tell them we'll do whatever they want. Just come home. Another pause. Then, quietly, I can't come home yet. Frauke's mother Ingrid had been sitting nearby, clutching her husband's arm. She took the phone, desperation thick in her voice. Frauke, are you safe? Is someone holding you? A hesitation. Then, I have to go. The line went dead. The police were already monitoring the calls by this point, but tracing them in real time was proving difficult. Each call came from a new location, making it nearly impossible to pinpoint Frauke's exact whereabouts. The authorities now strongly suspected that she was being held against her will. But by whom? And why? As the days dragged on, speculation ran wild. The media caught wind of the case, broadcasting images of Frauke's smiling face across Germany. Strangers called in tips, but nothing concrete emerged. Some believed she had been kidnapped by someone she knew. Others feared she had fallen into the hands of a serial predator. But there was no clear evidence to support either theory. Then, on June 27th, 7 days after she vanished, Frauke's phone rang again. This time, it was Natasha who answered. Frauke, where are you? She blurted before she could stop herself. Frauke's voice came through the line, soft, measured. Natasha, you have to tell us where you are, Natasha pleaded. Please, we'll come get you. We'll do anything. Just tell us. I can't, Frauke whispered. Then, after a pause, she added something chilling. I want to come home. Natasha felt her stomach twist. Then come home, Frauke. Tell me where you are, and we'll come now. Right now. Another long pause. Then, almost too softly to hear, Frauke said, I can't. Then the line went dead again. This time, the police had been monitoring the call closely. The location? Another rural area outside Paderborn. But just like before, by the time officers arrived, there was no trace of Frauke or whoever had been with her. It was as if they were always just one step behind. The strange, sporadic communication continued to baffle investigators. The lack of a clear ransom demand suggested this wasn't a typical kidnapping for financial gain. If Frauke was being held captive, why was she being allowed to make phone calls? And if she was free to leave, why hadn't she? That night, Frank lay awake, replaying her words over and over. I want to come home. She had said it, and yet she hadn't left. The implications haunted him. Either she was being prevented from leaving, or she was being manipulated into staying. By now, the case had consumed the entire city. Posters with Frauke's face lined the streets. Friends and volunteers searched every abandoned building, every stretch of forest. Her face was on the news, on missing persons' websites, on social media. Everyone was looking for her, and yet she remained missing. The next day, another text arrived. I will come home soon, but no one believed it anymore. The weight of Frauke's disappearance was pressing down on her family with unbearable force. Each passing day brought no new clues, only more uncertainty and fear. The police were working tirelessly, but without a clear suspect, the case remained a puzzle with too many missing pieces. June 28th marked the 8th day since Frauke had vanished, and for the first time in days, the phone remained silent. The eerie messages had stopped, and the family didn't know whether to feel relief or sheer terror. Was it possible she had finally escaped? Or had something far worse happened? Frauke's mother, Ingrid, clung to hope. Every night, she left the hallway light on, believing that at any moment, her daughter might walk through the front door, exhausted but safe. But deep down, a gnawing dread told her that this might not be how the story ended. The human mind is capable of many things: rationalization, denial. But even the strongest willpower cannot silence the feeling of impending doom. The media attention surrounding Frauke's case had reached national levels. Reporters swarmed the streets of Paderborn, pressing for any updates, but the police had little to offer. The investigation had taken a strange turn. Whoever had Frauke, if she wasn't alone, seemed intent on keeping her just close enough to be heard, but always too far to be found. Then, on the evening of June 29th, the phone rang again. Frauke's mother nearly dropped the receiver as she answered. Frauke! A long silence followed before a familiar voice whispered, Mama! Tears spilled down Ingrid's face. My darling, where are you? Please tell me, we will come right now. I can't stay much longer, Frauke said, her tone almost resigned. I love you all. Ingrid's breath caught in her throat. Who is with you? Are you safe? A pause. Then, quietly, I have to go. Click. The phone went dead. Ingrid stood frozen, the receiver still in her hand. Frauke had never said anything like that before. I can't stay much longer. What did it mean? Was she running out of time? Frank immediately called Detective Schaefer, the lead investigator on the case. Within minutes, officers were back at the Liebs household, attempting to trace the call. But just like the others, it had originated from yet another location outside Paderborn. This time, from an industrial area near Lippstadt. Patrol units were sent immediately, sirens cutting through the night air. The industrial zone was vast, filled with abandoned warehouses and empty parking lots. Officers combed the area, flashlights bouncing off the cracked pavement, searching for any sign of Frauke. But there was nothing, no trace of her. Just like before, they had arrived too late. As the sun rose the next morning, exhaustion set in among both the investigators and Frauke's family. The pattern was undeniable now. Whoever had her was deliberately keeping her just out of reach. And with every call, it felt as if she was slipping further away. Detective Schaefer sat down with Frank and Ingrid that morning, his face lined with concern. I won't lie to you, he admitted. This case is unlike anything we've ever handled. If she was being held against her will, why allow her to make phone calls? And if she was free, why hadn't she come home? Frank leaned forward, his voice firm. Then we're missing something. We have to be. This isn't random. Someone is playing a game with us. Schaefer nodded gravely. And I fear we're running out of time to figure out why. The words lingered in the air like a dark omen. That evening, the phone remained silent once again. No calls. No messages. The silence was unbearable. And this time it felt permanent. The morning of June 30th arrived with an unsettling quiet. It had been nearly 10 days since Frauke had vanished, and the weight of uncertainty had begun to break the spirits of her loved ones. The family sat together at the kitchen table, staring at the phone, willing it to ring. But the silence persisted. Detective Schaefer was already at the police station, reviewing every lead they had gathered. They had traced Frauke's calls to various locations outside of Paderborn, but each time they arrived, there was no sign of her. It was as if someone was moving her just ahead of them, always staying one step ahead. Schaefer leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temple. What if she's being forced to make those calls? What if someone is dictating what she says? The possibility was horrifying, yet it explained why Frauke's messages had sounded so unnatural. Meanwhile, Frauke Liebs had taken matters into his own hands. He refused to just sit and wait. He drove through every area the calls had been traced to, checking gas stations, bus stops, even abandoned buildings. Every time he thought he might be close, the absence of his sister struck him like a knife to the gut. That afternoon, a development emerged. A local woman reported seeing someone who looked like Frauke at a rest stop outside Lippstadt. The witness claimed the young woman was sitting alone, staring blankly ahead, as if in a trance. She hadn't called the police at the time, thinking it might have just been someone waiting for a ride. But now, with the news coverage intensifying, she was certain it had been Frauke. Schaefer and his team rushed to the location, but once again, it was too late. There was no sign of her. However, surveillance footage from the rest stop showed a blurry image of a woman resembling Frauke, sitting on a bench, looking down at her phone. More disturbingly, a figure loomed just out of frame. The police enhanced the footage, trying to get a better look, but the person's face remained obscured. What was clear, however, was that Frauke had not been alone. The news sent a fresh wave of dread through her family. If she had been seen at a rest stop, why hadn't she asked for help? Why hadn't she tried to run? The questions continued to pile up with no answers. That night, the silence stretched into the early hours of the morning. The Liebs family refused to sleep, waiting, hoping, pleading for another call. At 2:38 a.m., the phone finally rang. Frank nearly knocked over his chair as he lunged for it. Frauke! A pause. Then her voice soft, distant. Frank! His hands tightened around the receiver. Frauke, where are you? Please, we can help you. Just tell me where you are. There was another pause. Then, almost as if reading from a script, she said, I can't say. But I want to come home. Frank's heart pounded. Who is with you? Are you being held? Frauke didn't answer directly. Instead, her next words sent a chill down his spine. Tell Mama and Papa I love them. Frank's breath hitched. Frauke, don't say it like that. We will get you home. We just need to know where you are. Another silence. Then, in a quiet, almost resigned voice, Frauke said, "I have to go now." The call ended. Frank slammed the phone down, fury and despair mixing inside him. It had been different this time. There was no empty reassurance, no vague promises. This had sounded like a goodbye. The police acted immediately, tracing the call's origin. But just like before, it was coming from yet another rural location, this time from a quiet stretch of road leading toward Borchen. They dispatched units within minutes, racing toward the site. But when they arrived, they found nothing. Only an empty, moonlit road and the sound of wind through the trees. Frauke was gone. The morning after the eerie late-night call, a dark cloud of hopelessness settled over the Liebs household. Frauke had sounded different this time. The calm detachment in her voice, the cryptic messages, and now the sudden shift to what felt like a final farewell. It was unbearable. Detective Schaefer arrived at the family home early that morning. He had spent the night reviewing the latest call trace, which had once again led to a dead end. Frauke, or whoever was with her, was staying mobile. The person controlling her movements was deliberately leading them in circles, never allowing them to get close. Frank sat at the kitchen table, gripping a cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. What now? What if she doesn't call again? His voice was hoarse from exhaustion. Schaefer hesitated. "We don't give up, Frank, but we need more to work with. Someone saw her at that rest stop. That means she's alive. But she's not alone." Frauke's mother, Ingrid, shook her head, her hands trembling. "I don't understand. If she was free, why wouldn't she just run? Why wouldn't she ask for help?" No one had an answer. That afternoon, the police received another tip. A truck driver claimed he had seen a young woman matching Frauke's description near a petrol station in Buren, a small town roughly 20 kilometers from Paderborn. He described her as standing beside a dark-colored car, speaking to a man in the driver's seat. The truck driver had no idea at the time that he was potentially witnessing a missing persons case. But after seeing Frauke's face on the news, he was sure it had been her. Schaefer immediately dispatched a team to review security footage from the station. It was grainy and inconclusive. A woman who could have been Frauke was indeed visible near a car, but the angle was too poor to confirm her identity. The man in the driver's seat was obscured. The only notable detail? The car had left the petrol station, heading toward a desolate stretch of countryside. By now, the police had one terrifying realization. Whoever had Frauke was taking her farther away from any place she could be found. That night, the waiting resumed. The phone sat in the center of the Liebs' kitchen table, surrounded by anxious faces. But it remained silent. Frank paced the floor, muttering under his breath. "She has to call. She always calls." Minutes turned to hours. Midnight came and went, and still no call. Then, at 1:44 a.m., the phone finally rang. Ingrid grabbed it first. "Frauke!" A pause. "Mama," Frauke whispered. Her voice was weaker now, almost as if she were struggling to stay awake. Ingrid held back tears. "Where are you, my love? Please, we'll come for you. Just tell us where you are." I can't say," Frauke said, her breathing uneven. "But I love you all." "Frauke, baby, is someone with you? Are you hurt?" Another long silence. Then faintly, "I have to go now." The line went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Frank slammed his fist on the table. That was different. She sounded weak. "What if she's—" "Don't say it," Ingrid snapped, her voice cracking. "She's alive. She has to be." Schaefer immediately ordered another trace, but the results were the same. The call had come from another remote area, this time closer to Lichtenau. By the time officers arrived at the location, they found nothing but an empty roadside stop, surrounded by dense woods. Frauke was gone again. And this time, the feeling of doom was almost unbearable. The weight of Frauke's final words lingered heavily over her family. The fear that had been gnawing at them for days now solidified into something even worse. The certainty that time was running out. Each call had felt progressively more ominous, and her voice, once calm, almost scripted, now sounded weak, distant, as if she was fading away. Detective Schaefer doubled his efforts. He gathered his team early that morning and reviewed every lead, every witness statement, every piece of evidence they had. It wasn't much. The person holding Frauke had been meticulous, ensuring that she remained just out of reach. Frank sat with his parents in the living room, staring blankly at the phone. The silence in the house was suffocating. "We need to do something," he muttered. "We can't just wait for another call." But there was nothing they could do. The police had already searched the last known locations of Frauke's phone signals. Every time they got close, she or her captor had moved on. That night, for the first time in nearly a week, the phone didn't ring. The absence of a call was somehow worse than receiving another cryptic message. It meant the cycle had been broken. Was Frauke no longer able to call? Had something happened? By the next morning, Schaefer had a new plan. He arranged a televised plea, urging the public for any information. Frauke's parents, exhausted and devastated, stood before the cameras, pleading for their daughter's safe return. "If you know anything, please come forward. We just want our daughter home," Ingrid sobbed, gripping her husband's hand tightly. The broadcast aired across Germany. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of calls flooded the hotline. Some were from well-intentioned citizens who thought they had seen something. Others were cruel pranksters, exploiting the family's suffering. But one call stood out. A man claimed to have seen a young woman resembling Frauke in a black sedan near Delbrück, a town 25 kilometers from Paderborn. According to the witness, she had been sitting in the passenger seat, looking out the window. She didn't seem distressed, but something about her expression had unnerved him. The police took the lead seriously and immediately dispatched officers to the area. They searched for hours, stopping every black sedan they could find, questioning drivers, checking surveillance footage from nearby gas stations and convenience stores. But just like before, they found nothing. Frank clenched his fists in frustration. "Whoever has her, they're playing games. They want us to suffer." Schaefer didn't disagree. Every move, every message, every sighting felt deliberate, as if Frauke's captor was feeding them just enough information to keep hope alive, but never enough to find her. As the sun set, the sense of helplessness deepened. They were running out of options, running out of leads. And most terrifying of all, they feared they were running out of time. The night dragged on in unbearable silence. The phone remained still, and with each passing hour, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier. The absence of a call felt more ominous than any of Frauke's cryptic messages. It was as if an invisible clock had stopped ticking, like the end of something was approaching. Frank couldn't sleep. He sat in the kitchen, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows across the tiled floor. His mother had finally collapsed from exhaustion, her tear-streaked face buried in a pillow on the couch. His father sat next to her, gripping her hand, staring blankly ahead. The next morning, the police called. Detective Schaefer had spent the entire night reviewing possible leads, but they were running into the same problem. They were always a step too late. Whoever had Frauke was smart, deliberately mobile, never staying in one place long enough for police to act. Schaefer met Frank at the police station. "We need to expand the search radius. Whoever is moving her, they aren't keeping her in the same area. We need more eyes." Frank nodded. "What do we do? Another public appeal? More posters?" Schaefer sighed. "Yes, but this time we're going bigger. National." The Liebs family appeared on television again that evening, their faces worn with exhaustion but determined. This time it wasn't just a plea, it was a demand. "If anyone knows something, if you've seen anything, please tell us," Ingrid said, voice trembling but strong. "Whoever has Frauke, please let her go." The broadcast sent waves across Germany. Calls flooded in again, just like before. But this time, one tip was different. A gas station attendant in Hüvelhof, a small town between Paderborn and Delbrück, called in. He remembered seeing a girl matching Frauke's description late at night. She had been in a car with a man, but what struck him was her demeanor. She looked exhausted, her face pale, her eyes unfocused. She barely spoke, only nodding when the man next to her paid for their fuel. The description sent chills down Frank's spine. Did she seem afraid? Did she try to run? The attendant hesitated. Not afraid, exactly. Just empty, like she wasn't really there. The police pulled footage from the gas station, but the camera quality was poor. A dark-colored car, possibly a sedan. A man in the driver's seat, and a blurry figure in the passenger side, one that could be Frauke. The man was careful. No license plate visible. No clear shot of his face. But now they had something. Proof that Frauke had been alive at least 24 hours ago. Proof that she was being transported. And proof that whoever had her, he wasn't done moving her yet. Frank clenched his fists. "We're close. We have to be." But Schaefer's face remained grim. Or we're running out of time. The small thread of hope provided by the gas station sighting propelled the investigation into overdrive. Detective Schaefer ordered every available unit to focus on traffic cameras and any other gas stations along the major routes out of Paderborn. If Frauke had been seen there, chances were that her captor had continued moving her through similar stops. For Frank and his parents, the waiting was unbearable. Each minute without a new call or a new sighting felt like an eternity. The calls had stopped, and in their place, only a deafening silence remained. Ingrid Liebs clutched Frauke's childhood photo, whispering prayers into the stillness of their home. By noon, a second tip came in. A highway surveillance camera had caught footage of a car similar to the one at the gas station. The footage was grainy, but the timestamp indicated that it had passed through the checkpoint just an hour after Frauke's last confirmed sighting. The police could now determine a possible direction. The car had been heading southeast, toward Lichtenau, a town with vast stretches of countryside and wooded areas. Schaefer immediately dispatched patrols to check any rest stops, motels, and secluded locations. Frank insisted on going along, unwilling to sit back while the search intensified. The idea that Frauke could be out there somewhere, still alive, pushed him forward even through exhaustion. The search lasted hours, but by dusk there was still no sign of the car or Frauke. Frank stood at the edge of a quiet gas station in Lichtenau, staring at the road stretching ahead. It felt endless, as if it could swallow his sister whole. What if we're always just behind them? What if we're chasing shadows? He murmured, frustration and exhaustion evident in his voice. Schaefer placed a firm hand on his shoulder. We're closing in. Whoever has her is running out of places to go. If she's still being moved, they have to stop eventually. As night fell, the police made another desperate attempt at gathering more information. They released an official statement, warning the public that Frauke may be in the presence of a dangerous individual. They urged truck drivers, shop workers, and anyone traveling the major roads to keep an eye out for the girl with auburn hair, wearing the same white top and jeans she was last seen in. The media response was immediate. Television stations aired segments about Frauke, news anchors emphasizing the urgency of her disappearance. People across Germany began posting online about her case, hoping that someone somewhere would see her and call it in. At 2:17 a.m., the Liebs phone rang. Frank grabbed it instantly. Frauke! A long silence. Then the voice they had been dreading, weak, distant, almost a whisper. Frank! Relief and fear clashed within him. Frauke, where are you? Tell me, we're coming to get you. There was a hesitation, then barely audible. I'm so tired. Frank's chest tightened. Stay awake, Frauke. Just stay awake. We're close, we're looking for you. I can't, she breathed. Then, for the first time, a noise in the background, something indistinct, muffled like movement or a voice too far from the receiver. Frauke, who's there with you? Are you alone? A pause. Then a single phrase that sent a cold shiver down his spine. I have to go now. Click. The call ended. This time, the trace came back almost instantly. The signal had come from a remote wooded area just outside Lichtenau. Schaefer didn't wait. Move now. Everyone to Lichtenau. Frank had never seen police move so fast. Sirens blared through the night as cars raced down the empty roads, tires screeching as they turned off onto dirt paths leading into dense forest. Flashlights pierced the darkness as officers spread out, calling Frauke's name, scanning every shadow. The search went on for hours, but there was nothing. No car, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Frauke was gone again, and this time the dread was unbearable. The air in Lichtenau was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine as police officers scoured the forest under the beam of their flashlights. The eerie silence of the woods was occasionally punctuated by the distant rustling of leaves or the sound of twigs snapping underfoot. Frauke's last phone call had come from here. She had been close, so close that Frank felt like he could almost reach out and find her. And yet, she had once again disappeared without a trace. The search continued through the night, but as dawn began to break, exhaustion settled heavily upon the officers. The terrain was vast, with dense foliage and hidden paths leading deeper into the unknown. If Frauke was being held here, her captor had chosen a place where no one would find them easily. The dogs brought in for tracking caught a faint scent near a clearing, but it led to nothing. A dead end, just like every other lead they had followed. Frank stood on the edge of the search area, his hands clenched into fists. His head throbbed from lack of sleep, his body felt drained, but he refused to stop. His sister was out there, and every second that passed meant she was in greater danger. Detective Schaefer approached, his face lined with fatigue, but still carrying a determined edge. "We need to regroup," he said. "We'll widen the search radius, check abandoned buildings, talk to anyone living in the area. If she's being moved, someone must have seen something." Frank exhaled sharply. "I don't understand how they're always ahead of us. Every time we get close, she's gone. It's like he knows we're coming." Schaefer's jaw tightened. Maybe he does. The implication was chilling. Was someone within the investigation leaking information? Was Frauke's captor listening in somehow? The thought sent a fresh wave of paranoia through Frank. Later that day, new leads began pouring in. The media coverage had reached new heights, and more calls flooded the police hotline. One caller, a woman from a nearby village, reported seeing a man and a young woman at a roadside diner 3 nights earlier. The woman, she claimed, looked exhausted and unwell. The man barely let her speak. When the waitress asked if she needed help, the man had quickly ended their meal and left. The woman had thought nothing of it at the time, but after seeing Frauke's face on the news, she was sure it had been her. The description of the man was vague, medium build, dark hair, wearing a cap. It was frustratingly unspecific, but it was something. By the afternoon, another sighting came in. This time, a truck driver reported seeing a young woman walking alone on a side road not far from Liptonov. She had looked lost, disoriented. The driver had slowed down to offer help, but before he could stop, a car pulled up beside her. A man got out, grabbed her by the arm, and led her into the vehicle. It had happened so fast that by the time the driver registered what he was seeing, the car had already sped off. The description of the vehicle, a dark-colored sedan, matched the previous sighting. This time, however, the witness had caught part of the license plate. Schaefer wasted no time. "Run it through every database we have. We're finding this car." Hours later, the results came back. The plate was a partial match for a vehicle registered in a neighboring town. The owner? A man named Michael Werner, a 37-year-old with no prior criminal record. He had never been on the police's radar, until now. By nightfall, the police were en route to his last known address, a small house at the edge of a wooded area. Frank insisted on coming along. The air was thick with tension as the officers pulled up to the property. The house was dark, no lights visible from the windows. Schaefer signaled for silence as they approached the front door. A faint sound echoed from within, movement, the shifting of something heavy. Then a scream. Frank's blood ran cold. "Frauke!" The officers sprang into action. "Police! Open the door!" Schaefer shouted, pounding on the wood. No answer. Only more frantic movement inside. Without hesitation, one of the officers kicked the door in. It burst open, revealing a cluttered living room with furniture overturned, papers scattered everywhere. And in the corner, a figure frail and terrified. Frauke! She was bound at the wrists, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. She had lost weight, her once vibrant expression now hollow and drained. The moment she saw Frank, a choked sob escaped her lips. But there was no time. Footsteps thundered from the back of the house. "He's running!" an officer yelled. Michael Werner had bolted through the back door, disappearing into the night. Schaefer wasted no time. "Go after him!" Frank didn't hesitate either. He surged forward, untangling the rope from Frauke's wrists. "It's okay. You're safe now," he whispered, his voice breaking. Frauke collapsed into his arms, sobbing. I thought I'd never see you again." The nightmare wasn't over yet. But for the first time in 10 days, Frauke Liebs was finally safe. The relief of finding Frauke was quickly overshadowed by the realization that her captor was still on the loose. Michael Werner had vanished into the darkness, using the dense forest behind his property as an escape route. Schaefer immediately called for backup, his voice firm as he issued orders. "We need roadblocks set up at every major exit point. He cannot get far." Officers spread out, flashlights cutting through the darkness, as they pursued the man who had eluded them for too long. Frank held onto Frauke tightly, his hands shaking as he reassured her. "You're safe now. We have you. You're not alone anymore." Frauke was barely able to hold herself up. She clung to Frank as though she might disappear if she let go. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I thought it would never end. The paramedics arrived moments later, carefully helping Frauke into the ambulance. Ingrid and her husband, who had been rushed to the scene, broke down in tears the moment they saw their daughter. Ingrid wrapped Frauke in her arms, pressing her against her chest, as though she could somehow erase the horrors of the past 10 days with sheer force of love. You're home now, Ingrid whispered through tears. You're home. Frauke winced as they examined her injuries. Bruises along her wrists from where she had been restrained, the dull pallor of her skin from lack of proper nutrition. But what hurt more than any physical wound was the terror still reflected in her eyes. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Werner intensified. Officers combed the forest, their dogs leading the way as they searched for any sign of him. Helicopters with infrared cameras scanned the treetops, looking for any heat signatures. An hour passed, then another. Schaefer paced near his squad car, radio in hand, frustration creeping into his expression. We should have found him by now. He can't have gotten far. Just as he spoke, a call came through. Suspect spotted near the riverbank. We're moving in. Every officer on site mobilized instantly. Frank, despite everything, felt himself drawn toward the unfolding chase. He wanted to see the man who had taken his sister brought to justice. By the time they reached the riverbank, Werner was cornered. Officers had surrounded him, their weapons drawn, as he stood with his hands raised. His face was streaked with sweat, his eyes darting wildly, looking for any possible escape. But there was none. It's over, Schaefer called out. There's nowhere left to run. For a moment, Werner hesitated. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to the ground, surrendering. Frank exhaled, his hands still shaking. It was finally over. Within minutes, Werner was in cuffs, being led toward a waiting police car. Frank watched as he was shoved inside, but Werner never looked his way. He kept his eyes on the ground, offering no explanation, no apology. Back at the hospital, Frauke was given a full medical evaluation. Despite everything, she had survived. The doctors assured the family that, physically, she would recover. The emotional scars, however, would take much longer to heal. When Frank finally stepped into her hospital room, Frauke turned to him with tears in her eyes. I was so scared, she whispered. Every day I thought it was the end. Frank sat beside her, taking her hand in his. But it wasn't. You fought, and we never stopped looking for you. Frauke nodded, squeezing his hand. Thank you for not giving up. The nightmare had ended, but the road to healing had only just begun. The relief of having Frauke back was overwhelming, but it was quickly followed by an unavoidable reality. There were still questions that needed answers. The police had Werner in custody, but the investigation was far from over. Detective Schaefer sat in the interrogation room across from Werner, who remained disturbingly calm. His hands were shackled to the table, and yet his posture was relaxed, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. Schaefer took a deep breath. You've had Frauke for 10 days. Why? Werner remained silent, his lips barely twitching as he stared at the detective. The air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. The only sound was the low hum of the overhead light. We know you moved her from place to place. She called her family multiple times, always from different locations. What was your plan? Schaefer pressed, trying to get anything, out of him. Still, Werner said nothing. His silence was infuriating. Schaefer could feel his patience thinning, but he knew he had to remain calm. Meanwhile, Frauke's family stayed by her side in the hospital. She had been given sedatives to help her sleep, but the nightmares still came. Frank sat beside her bed, watching as she stirred restlessly, her face twisted in fear even in sleep. When she finally woke, her eyes darted around the room in panic before settling on her brother. Frank! Her voice was hoarse. I'm here, he said softly, squeezing her hand. Tears welled in her eyes. Is he gone? Frank nodded. They caught him. He's in custody. He can't hurt you anymore. She exhaled shakily, gripping his hand tighter. I don't understand why he let me call. Why did he keep moving me? Her voice trembled as she tried to make sense of it all. Frank didn't have an answer, but he could see the pain in her eyes, the torment of being held captive, of not knowing if she would survive. Over the next few days, Frauke slowly began to recover. The police visited her in the hospital to gather her statement. Every detail she provided was critical in building the case against Werner. He wasn't always angry. she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes he acted normal, like we were just traveling. But then he would get distant again, like he was somewhere else in his mind. Did he ever mention why he took you? Schaefer asked gently. Frauke hesitated. He said he just wanted someone to talk to. He wanted me to keep him company. Frank's stomach twisted. The thought of his sister being used as some twisted form of companionship made his blood boil. Back in the interrogation room, Schaefer leaned forward. Frauke says you wanted company. That's why you took her. For the first time, Werner reacted. He smiled, just slightly, but it was enough to send a chill down Schaefer's spine. Did I? Werner mused. Or was it something else? Schaefer's jaw tightened. You tell me. Werner leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. She was special. I wasn't going to hurt her. I just needed time. Schaefer felt rage build inside him. Time for what? Werner didn't answer. Instead, he simply smiled again, his silence as haunting as his crimes. The days after Frauke's rescue were filled with both relief and frustration. While her family rejoiced in her return, the trauma of her captivity remained a looming shadow. The investigation into Michael Werner continued, but he remained as elusive as ever, his cryptic responses doing little to provide clarity. At the hospital, Frauke was slowly regaining her strength. The medical staff ensured she was physically stable, but mentally, she was still trapped in those 10 days. The fear, the confusion, the waiting, it was all still there, lingering just beneath the surface. Frank stayed by her side, refusing to leave her alone. He could see the changes in his sister, the way her shoulders tensed at sudden noises, the way she hesitated before answering even the simplest questions. It was as if she was still expecting Werner to control the narrative, to dictate what she could and couldn't say. Frauke, Frank said gently one afternoon, sitting beside her hospital bed. You don't have to be afraid anymore. She turned her tired eyes to him. I know, she whispered, but I don't feel safe. Frank's chest ached at her words. I promise he's never coming near you again. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Schaefer continued his battle with Werner. The man was calm, almost eerily so, sitting with his hands folded neatly in front of him. He had barely moved in the hours he had been held in interrogation. Schaefer threw down another file onto the table. We have surveillance footage. Witnesses. We found Frauke in your house. You're done, Werner. Werner tilted his head slightly. Am I? Schaefer clenched his jaw. Why did you take her? Werner smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I already told you. She was special. You kept her for 10 days. Let her call her family. Moved her from place to place. What was your endgame? Schaefer pressed. Werner exhaled, as if considering his answer. She was supposed to understand. Understand what? That I didn't mean her harm. Schaefer's patience was wearing thin. You kidnapped her. You terrified her family. You destroyed her sense of security. And you think she was supposed to understand? Werner's expression didn't change. People don't always know what's best for them. Schaefer stared at him, rage simmering just beneath the surface. You're delusional. Werner leaned back slightly. Maybe. Or maybe I just wanted something I couldn't have. The words sent a chill down Schaefer's spine. There was no remorse in Werner's voice. No regret. Just cold, detached acceptance. Back at the hospital, Frauke sat up in bed, staring out the window. The evening sky was a deep shade of orange, the sun slowly sinking below the horizon. I used to love watching the sunset, she murmured. Frank looked at her. You still can. She was silent for a moment. It doesn't feel the same. Frank reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. Give it time. Frauke swallowed hard, then nodded. But deep down, she wondered if time would ever be enough to make her feel whole again. The days following Werner's arrest felt surreal. Frauke had returned home, but her house, once a place of comfort, felt unfamiliar. Everything inside was the same, yet she wasn't. Shadows seemed darker, silence felt heavier, and every unexpected sound sent her heart racing. She was free, but in many ways she was still trapped. Frank stayed close, watching her with the protective instincts of an older brother who had almost lost someone he loved. He tried to ease her transition, filling their home with light and conversation. But he saw the cracks in her resolve, the way she avoided the windows at night, the way she hesitated before answering calls, as if expecting Werner's voice on the other end. Their parents tiptoed around her, terrified of saying the wrong thing. They were relieved, of course, but their joy was muted by the knowledge that their daughter had endured something unspeakable. The trauma clung to her like a second skin, invisible to the world but all-consuming within. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Frauke finally spoke the words Frank had been dreading. "I don't think I can stay here." Frank turned to her, setting down the cup of tea he had been holding. "What do you mean?" She stared at her hands, tracing invisible patterns on her palm. "I can't sleep here. I can't close my eyes without seeing that room, without feeling like I'm still there." Frank felt his stomach twist. "You don't have to go anywhere, Frauke. We can get help, we can—" "I am getting help," she interrupted, her voice firmer than he had heard in weeks. "But I need space to breathe. I can't heal if I feel like I'm still looking over my shoulder." He swallowed his protest, knowing deep down that she was right. "Where will you go?" She hesitated. "I was thinking of staying with Aunt Karen for a while, just until I feel steady again." Frank exhaled, nodding slowly. He hated the idea of her leaving, but he hated the thought of her suffering more. "Okay, but promise me something." She looked up at him. "Anything. Don't shut us out. If you need anything, you call me. No matter what." A small, fragile smile touched her lips. "I promise." Meanwhile, at the police station, Werner remained as silent as ever. The investigators had everything they needed: witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and Frauke's own statement. But Werner refused to give them the one thing that could bring closure: a reason. Detective Schaefer leaned forward, studying Werner's vacant expression. "She survived. She's talking. It's over." Werner's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. "Is it?" Schaefer narrowed his eyes. "You'll never walk free again." Werner held his gaze, unblinking. "Maybe not. But what I wanted, I got." Schaefer's hands curled into fists beneath the table. "And what exactly did you want?" The silence stretched long before Werner finally answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "To be remembered." A cold chill ran down Schaefer's spine. He had seen evil before, but never had it felt so calculated, so precise. Frauke's story was far from over. She would heal, she would move forward, but Werner's shadow would always linger, a reminder of the darkness she had escaped. But she had escaped, and that, more than anything, was what mattered. Frauke stood by the doorway of her childhood home, her bag packed, her heart heavy. The house that once held so many happy memories now felt suffocating. Every room, every shadow, every quiet moment reminded her of those 10 days, of waiting, of fearing, of surviving. She wasn't running away. She was searching for a space where she could breathe again. Frank leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching her with wary eyes. "You sure about this?" Frauke nodded, though doubt flickered behind her eyes. "I need to try." Their mother, Ingrid, hugged her tightly, lingering longer than usual. "You'll call every day?" "Every day," Frauke promised. Her father placed a warm hand on her shoulder. "You take all the time you need. But remember, this is your home. No matter what." She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. With one last glance at Frank, she stepped outside into the cool air. The drive to her Aunt Karen's house was long, the landscape rolling by in a blur of fields and small towns. It felt strange to be moving forward after everything, to put distance between herself and the place where her life had nearly been stolen. Meanwhile, at the police station, Detective Schaefer sat at his desk, staring at Werner's case file. The man had been formally charged, his trial set to begin in the coming months. Yet despite all the evidence, despite his capture, something about the case gnawed at Schaefer's instincts. Werner hadn't fought back. He hadn't begged for a deal. He had sat there calm, content in his silence. Schaefer tapped his pen against the desk, flipping through Frauke's testimony again. Werner had taken her, moved her, let her call home. But what had he been waiting for? What was his endgame? A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. An officer stepped in, holding a folder. The psychological evaluation on Werner came back. "You might want to see this." Schaefer took the folder and scanned the pages. Werner had been deemed fit to stand trial, but there was something unnerving in the psychiatrist's notes. Subject displays no signs of remorse. Motivation unclear. May have orchestrated entire event for psychological power rather than traditional means of control. Schaefer exhaled sharply. He never intended to keep her forever. He wanted the fear, the chase. And now he has a captive audience in court. the officer added grimly. Back at Aunt Karen's house, Frauke sat on the small wooden porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The quiet here was different. It didn't feel like a trap. It felt like the first step towards something new. She took out her phone and scrolled through old messages, ones from before her kidnapping. Friends planning movie nights, talking about exams, complaining about work. It felt like another life. A new message popped up. "Frank, you good?" A small smile tugged at her lips. "Yeah, getting there." She set the phone down, exhaling deeply. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in weeks, she felt something close to hope. She had survived, and now she was ready to live again.